What's up, sound painters? This is a follow-up to the preparing the palette video. So if you're not really sure how you would actually compile a list of materials, I'm going to show you how you would do this in a variety of different ways, including how you would do this in tonal music, non-tonal music, how you would do timbral combinations, orchestration decisions, rhythmic ideas, like if you have rhythmic cells or if you have complete rhythmic ideas, I can show you how you would do that in a variety of ways. So I'm going to do this with some manuscript paper. So I'm just going to go ahead and start sketching. So let's just say that you're going to start off with tonal ideas because you happen to write music that's predominantly triadic or diatonic. So the way that I would do that is I would think about what I'm going to actually, like what key I'm going to write in, and then I would start writing all of the possible chords. Let's just take C major since it's the easiest key to think about. And then we're going to write out all of the possibilities in C major. So if it's diatonic, basically it's every triad in the scale, right? So I'm just going to write these out really quick. So we have these 7 triads in the diatonic scale. That would be like the easiest way that you could do that, right? So you have 7 chords because there are 7 notes, so you can build 7 sets of triads. And we can label these with their Roman numerals. So uppercase means major, lowercase means minor. And then of course, the triad built on B in C major is a diminished chord, and it's the only one in the scale that's going to be diminished. So you would have those 7 chords if you're going to prepare the palette with just diatonic harmony. And you could do a lot already with just these 7 chords. You could then just start to build chord progressions. Like this is basically how chord progressions are built. Like you would have 1, 4, 5, 1, 1, 6, 4, 5, 1, 1, 2, 4, 5, 1. And then you could also add a 7th to all of these chords if that's going to be like what the sound palette is going to be for your piece. You could just add an additional stack, an additional 3rd on top, and that would be a way to sort of like expand the palette. And so then all of these just become 7th chords. That would be like a really easy way to do it. And you can extend them even further by adding 9ths, 11ths, 13ths, or whatever, so that you start to have a more expanded bank of options for what you're going to actually use when you start composing. And this is what I would consider, again, outside time. Now, inside time would be a situation where you actually have a particular progression, like if you're going to do 1, 4, 5, 1. So if you do something like that, chord progression exists inside time. It has a particular way that it unfolds. The inversions are set, and you wouldn't really mess with it much, right? It's basically as it is. And that would be how you would incorporate it into a piece. Now, that's a pretty boring chord progression. It's been used like a billion times, so you probably wouldn't want to start there. But that would just be an example of something inside time versus what we're doing here, which is outside time. We're just listing out what all of the possible options are in the diatonic context of C major. Now, if we wanted to get into chromatic harmonies, what we could do is just explore, well, how can we add chromaticism here? Now, there are a few ways that you can have chromaticism in diatonic music. You could basically do secondary dominance, which would be secondary dominant chords or secondary leading tone chords, either a 5 of something or a 7 of something, or a 5-7 of something or a 7-7 of something. Or you could have modal mixture where you borrow from a parallel mode. Now, usually like in Western classical music, this happens between major and minor, but it can really be between any modes. If you mix them, like you could mix Ionian with Phrygian or Lydian with Locrian or whatever, right? So that would be modal mixture. That would be a way to access chords and tones which are outside of the original 7-note scale that you started with. That would be a way to add chromaticism. And then the third way would be to use chromatic predominance. So there are a couple of chromatic predominant options, like augmented 6th chords, and we also have like the Neapolitan flat 2 chord, which is usually in first inversion, but not always. So these would be ways to do it. So I would just then list out those options, right? So we have secondary 5s or 7s. We also have modal mixture, and we also have chromatic predominance, i.e. augmented 6s or Neapolitan flat 2-6. So depending on what path you choose to go on, you would then make lists of all of these, and then that would inform the palette too. So you can see how this can start to become pretty detailed and rich, And that's part of the reason why there's still so many options for composing within the context of tonal music. Now, if none of this made sense, if all of this feels like very, very new stuff, then stay tuned for like the music theory course where I'm going to go into all of these different things. I'm going to teach you, chords and diatonic harmony. I'm going to teach you scales, chord extensions, when you have secondary fives or sevens, when you have modal mixture or chromatic predominance. So don't worry if this all feels very overwhelming. This is just to give you a sense of how preparing the palette would look in the context of tonal music. But there are other ways that we can do that. So let's look at a situation where you're trying to compile ideas outside of tonal music. So let's think post-tonal or non-tonal music. So let's imagine that you want to write a piece for cello that doesn't have any kind of key signature or any kind of like pitch center. So then you might think about composing in a different way. So you might think more about instrumental technique, or you might think about specific intervals or specific patterns that you want to explore. And this is basically like how Arnold Schoenberg, Webern, Berg, and then composers in the 20th century started to think. Now, it's not necessarily that this is going to be serial technique, but it's one way of thinking outside of diatonic harmony. Let's just start thinking about, like, since I'm a cellist, I'm going to help you think about writing for the cello. So let's think about an example where you would write for the cello. So if I'm going to write for the cello, I have to think about all of the different options for the cello. So cello is abbreviated as VC because the Italian word for cello is violoncello. And so we would just list out the options of techniques that the cello can do. And I'm just going to write them here. They can play with the bow. They can do pizzicato. And then when you break it down further, you can think, well, what can they do with the bow? Well, there's legato, there's spiccato, there's staccato. There's all kinds of different techniques that they could do with the bow. They can do tremolo. There are a ton of things. And you can check out my crash course on how to write for the cello to see how I go in more depth about how cellists would be able to use different techniques with the bow. Or there are different ways to do pizzicato. You can have arpeggiated pizzicati, or you can pluck one note at a time, or you can pluck chords, or you can strum. There are a variety of different ways that you would approach pizzicato. And so you make a list of all of those things. Now, there are other techniques that the cello can do, right? It's not just the bow and pizzicato. What other kinds of techniques are available to us? Well, we have harmonics, multiphonics. And a multiphonic is basically just when you get two harmonics to sound on one string at a time. So it's very easy to do. I go in more depth on how cellists are able to achieve that in the cello video, so feel free to check that out once you finish with this lesson. But there are a bunch of different techniques that cellists would do. Now, what I usually would recommend if you're a composer starting out, writing for an instrument that you're not familiar with, first, like I mentioned in the last video, you really do need to listen to all of the repertoire that you can find about that instrument so that you start to sort of ingrain in your ears what that music sounds like. Because if you don't, you might end up writing music that sounds like every other cello piece ever written, because composers just start and they think, well, I'm just going to come up with these ideas. I'm going to throw them on the staff. I'm going to just experiment with these things and blah, 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 right? And it ends up sounding like very homogeneous across a bunch of different pieces. You can't really distinguish how one is distinct from another. This is very true, especially like if you go to festivals or when you listen to composers' music in a university setting. It's very, very frequent that these pieces are going to sort of like blend together and you won't really remember them. So here's what I would recommend that you do. After you finish this listening phase, make a list of the things that are actually super exciting to you, and then you can further condense this thing down to what you actually want to write. Let's say that you're like super excited about pizzicato. Well, why are you excited about pizzicato? What specific thing attracts you sonically about pizzicato? And is there a way that you can express your ideas using pizzicato that feels authentic to who you are as a composer? When I think about pizzicato, a particular kind of sound world starts to emerge, and I start to get excited about that particular sound world. So it's obviously going to be in combination with other parameters or other layers of sound. But just to give you an example, if I'm going to just like zero in on pizzicato, I'm going to think, okay, I want to write a piece for pizzicato, but I'm going to use, instead of one cello, I'm going to use 4 cellos. And I'm going to use basically standard pizzicato, but I'm going to use like pizzicato rhythmic pockets, and I'm going to use microtonality. So now my palette has gotten a little bit more specific. I'm thinking about the pitch domain and the rhythmic domain at the same time as I'm thinking about timbre and technique. And so then the preparing the palette phase is a little bit easier because it's a sort of combination of elements, and I know what I have to do for the rhythmic hocket. I know what I have to do for the microtonality. And so then composing is just easier. I've zeroed in on what the idea needs to be. And when I actually compose, I can focus on one layer at a time. So if I want to create a rhythmic hocket, I just have to focus on rhythm first, and then I can determine what the actual notes are going to be. Now, let's say that I want to use both regular pizzicato and arpeggiated. So I'm going to say regular and arpeggiated. And that's just going to be like the way that I would start out. And then when I actually want to write a texture, I'm going to focus on the rhythm first. So if you don't know what a hocket is basically just an old, like either medieval or Renaissance technique from hundreds and hundreds of years ago, even before Bach's time, where a composer would basically split up the text of one particular line and it would get transferred to the different voices. So you would hear like one person say like the first 3 words, and then the next person would say the next 3 words, and then the next person would say the next 3 words, and it sort of gets like spatialized across the ensemble in that way. That's basically what a hocket is. I have adopted this term for my own music to be able to use it for rhythm or pitch unfoldings in time. And so if I'm going to do this with a pizzicato trajectory, I would just create a composite rhythm. So I'm just going to take this 4 cellos idea, and I'll have my regular and arpeggiated pizzicati. I'm going to have a rhythmic hocket, and it's going to be microtonal. So these are sort of like zeroing in on my bank of options, and it's going to have a very particular outcome for the actual music. So I'm going to create the rhythm first, and it's going to be sort of a whatever rhythm. You don't have to pay too much attention to what I'm actually doing here. This is just to give you an example of something that I might do in my own music. So the rhythm is kind of irrelevant, but let's say that I have these 4 beats, and I'm just going to test how this would work in the context of this piece. I'm going to make the downbeat tutti, and I'm going to say arpeggio. And I'm going to just indicate that by adding this squiggly line with an upwards ascending arrow. So that means everyone's going to ascend at the same time on the downbeat. And then I'm going to start splitting up the rhythmic composite into a hocket. And I'm just going to label each cello 1 through 4 since it's a quartet. And I would say cello 1, cello 2, cello 3, cello 4. That's my first unfolding. Then I'll say 1, 4, 2, 3. Then the next one's going to be 1, 3, 2. So now I have my rhythmic composite, and I basically just have to figure out what the notes are. Let's say that they're all going to start on the same chord, or maybe they're going to create sort of like a bigger chord. I'm just going to determine what this chord is on the downbeat, and I'm going to arbitrarily just decide that I'm going to have these notes in the chord. Let's see. I'm just making up a chord. Whatever, right? And I'll split that up. I'll say maybe this is cello 4, this is cello 3, and I'll refine this further in the future, and I'll just have like maybe something split between multiple things for cello 1. And they're all going to play that chord on downbeat 1. Now, this may need a little bit of refinement, but this is basically just to have a sense of what the compositional process would look like, and I'm just doing a very quick and dirty sample of how this would look. And then I'm going to write just like C quarter sharp, C natural, B, D quarter flat, etc. Right? So I'm just going to choose specific notes for each of these, and then I'm going to determine what all of the notes are going to be for each of the instruments. And then once I've done that, I can then break up the rhythm so that it would look like this, where the first cello's rhythm would be dotted 8th note 16th, and then the next attack is on beat 3, so I'm going to tie this to beat 2, and then I have another one, so I'm going to actually just make this a half note. Oh no, quarter note, sorry, because I have one on beat 4 as well. So that's cello 1's rhythm. Cello 2's rhythm for this would be to have the downbeat, beat 2, and then the and of 3, and then the last 16th of the bar. So you just break up what the rhythm would be, and then these would be happening at the same time. So I would then just determine what each of these parts are going to do. So let's say that cello 1 starts on C quarter sharp, the next one's going to be, or this is like the arpeggio, right? Then I have C quarter sharp, and then the other notes. Cello 2 is going to have that arpeggio on the first one, and then it has the C natural, and then more notes, right? And so on. And so that's how I would basically build this 4-beat sample of what this is going to sound like. Now, once I've gotten to this point, I've basically established what the texture is going to be. And if I just keep doing it like this arbitrarily, it's going to start to sound a little bit homogeneous. So how do we actually structure this? I would then zoom out a little bit further and think about the larger beats that are grouped together. So I would think of a larger shorthand, and I would say that, well, this is a 4-quarter cell, and that's what the current sort of like meta beat or the meter is going to be felt as. So then I would try to establish what the big beats are across the entire thing. So I might do something like 4, that goes to 6, that goes to 3.5, that goes to 1, that goes to 12. And again, this is super arbitrary, but then these would all be punctuated by arpeggios, because this is going to be the biggest event that the listener perceives as the most salient thing when everyone is tutti, so that I can actually make something that feels like it has form. So now you can see how this specific thing, this beat, sort of meta beat organization would be the most important thing, and this would be how I would fill each of these time buckets, so to speak. So that's how I would compose this particular thing. Now let's say that you want to broaden the palette of rhythmic possibilities. Let's say that you don't want to just have like the dotted 8th 16th or the 8th 16th 16th or 4 16th or like the 16th 8th 16th. Maybe you want to have triplets or quintuplets or septuplets, or maybe you want to have polyrhythms. So these are the things that you would then also establish in this phase. So you can say, well, what are all the options in this case? I can have what I already wrote. I can have the reverse of that. I can have 4 16ths, or I can have 2 16ths and then an eighth, or 1/8 and then 2 16ths. I can have the 16th 8th 16th, but I can also have triplets, or I can have quintuplets, and these are all within the framework of one single beat. Now obviously this would be different if you were to go outside of one beat. So if you want 2 beats, you could do the double of that, which is 5 quintuplet eighth notes or 3 triplet quarters. So all of these could then be looped back into the composite at a later time in the process. So that would be one way of broadening your rhythmic palette as well. Now you can obviously also mix some of these things. So let's say that you want to have 2 16ths and then triplets. You can do that. That would be one cell. So let's say that I want to have like 2 16ths and a dotted eighth, which are quintuplets. So there are a lot of different ways that you could create rhythmic composites, or have sort of like different kinds of rhythmic cells that would feed back into what the ensemble is actually going to be doing rhythmically, to be sort of like diversify the grids that are present. And when I say grids, I mean like you have grids that are divided evenly in 2s or 4s, grids that are evenly divided in 3s or 6s or 9s, grids that are divided by 5s or 7s or whatever, right? So that's how you can mix up the grids rhythmically. You could also think about specific pulse patterns. So when I think about pulse patterns, I tend to think about like 8th notes or 16th note pulse patterns. And when I think about them, I create a shorthand of like 3 or 5 or 6 or whatever. And 3 would equal like, let's say in this case, I'm thinking about 16ths. 5 equals 5 16ths, and so on. So if I want to create a pulse pattern, I might do something like 3. I will create a shorthand that would be 3 3 3 2 2 5 1 3 2 2 2, whatever, right? This is just a kind of whatever. And now I'm going to sort of like sight read this performance. So sorry if this doesn't come out right, but it would be like so that would be like basically what this pulse pattern would be like. Or you can say I'm going to group these, so like the 3-3-3 is one block and must always be 3-3-3, or maybe it's always going to be 2-2-5, or maybe it's always going to be 1-3, so ba 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 ba. Or maybe I'm always going to have 2-2-2, so ba 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 ba. And I'm going to label these as 1, 2, 3, and 4. And now what I can do is actually have a shorthand of the shorthand where 1 is going to be da 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 da, 2 is da 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 da, 3 is ba 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 ba, 4 is ba 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 ba. And now I'm going to do 1, 2, 3, 4, which is what I just performed earlier. I'm going to have 4, 3, 2, 1, which is the reverse of that. I can have 2, 1, 3, 4, 2, 3, 1, 4, 2, 4, 3, 1, etc. Right? So you can have all of the different combinations of what these pulses would be, and that would be another way to create rhythmic diversity and rhythmic action in your music, which you can then combine with what we did in the previous one. So that's why this phase of preparing the palette is so essential, because you're basically establishing what the actual piece is going to do, what it's going to, like how it's actually going to behave, and how you're actually going to compose it. So you're using intuition because you're saying, well, I want to do regular and arpeggiated rhythmic pockets with pizzicato, and I want it to be microtonal. That's what I intuitively sense is where the piece needs to live. And I'm technically actually going to achieve that by establishing what the composite rhythm is, establishing how I'm going to break that into the constituent parts for the quartet. How am I going to actually assign notes to each of these players? How am I going to actually decide on what the rhythms are? How am I going to diversify it? How am I going to add form to this texture so that it doesn't just feel like a boring unfolding of like a bunch of random rhythms, so that it actually has like dimension and shape and contrast? How can I add even further dimension and further contrast to the overall, like even further zoomed out level, where I'm thinking not just of like sort of aperiodic rhythmic composites, but I'm also thinking about periodicity in the framework of pulse patterns, where I have and that kind of thing. So there are a lot of different ways that you can very quickly figure out what you're going to write once you prepare the palette. Now, you could look at this from these angles outside of time, and then they become inside time. Or, as I've talked about in the past, you can do this inside time, where you think about timbral combinations. And this is, again, where a lot of people tend to start composing. And so if I were going to sketch out an idea where I'm actually thinking about inside time ideas for like timbral combinations, I might do something like, okay, I want to have like a tremolo that then crescendos and is punctuated by like a pizzicato, like a snap pizzicato. And I'm going to put the snap pizzicato symbol above it. And then I want that to have like a cascade of scalar notes, because it feels like that's like really important. And I want them to be slurred. And then I want that to be followed by like silence. So I have something that's like, that's basically what this block would sound like. And that's option 1. Option 2 is going to be, now I want to start with like my scalar objects, but I'm also going to go back up in the opposite direction. So this is going down, and then it also goes back up. That's going to be reinforced by glissandi in 2 parts that are going to sort of like color in a sort of microtonal way what this scalar descent is doing. And then that's going to be followed by a long sustain tremolo, and then multiple kinds of like regular pizzicati, snap pizzicati, and these are going to be tutti. That's option 2. And so then you can actually create variations of one, where you have variations of the note itself, variations of the length of this particular note, variations of the scale, either starting point, ending point, or any point in between. You can have variations of like the actual way that they're going to perform it, if it's going to be like a ricocheted bow where it bounces on the string, or if it's going to be like tremolo, scalar descent, or if it's going to be slurred legato, or if it's going to be piano or forte. You can decide if this is going to be like a swell or a crescendo or a decrescendo, where you start on sforzando and then it goes fortissimo and then pianissimo, and then fortissimo on all of these. So there are a lot of different variations that you can do once you have these starting elements. And then that's just thinking about timbre and, let's say, texture. And then once you have like a bunch of these, you just create your musical trajectory by, you know, kind of like Legos, just putting them into the places that you want them to appear, and you can line them up in specific ways. And that's just one way of thinking. You're just stitching together a quilt of options based on this phase of sketching possibilities. And then once you have the quilt, you can further develop it by cutting up the quilt into bigger pieces. And then what happens if you flip the entire thing backwards? Or what if you invert the entire thing? Or what if you transpose the entire thing 3 octaves down or 3 octaves up? Or, there are a billion different possibilities that you can do that you can start thinking about once you have these surface level details to start thinking about form. So I'll go more in depth onto how you would think about form in the next video. I hope that this demo of how you would actually do this in a practical way of how you would prepare the palette has been helpful for you. I'll see you in the next lesson.